Hello and welcome to our bi-weekly webinar series. This is a Washington, D.C. update on COVID-19 and also other public policy developments. I'm Caitlin Sickles. I'm a principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and today's webinar is brought to you by Bracewell, and my colleague Paul Nathanson is on the line, as well as by your on-the-ground lobbyists here in DC from the Franklin Partnership. Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik are also here. As always, these bi-weekly webinars are a production of the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association, and you will get a copy of this webinar in your email if you've registered. You will also be able to find it online at onevoiceinfo.org, where you can download this webinar and all of our previous webinars going back to about March of last year. So lots of content available online. You can also stay connected with us between webinars. You can tune into our podcast. It's called Talking with One Voice. It is also bi-weekly, every other week, so not when we're doing a webinar, but on the weeks in between. And you can find that wherever you get your podcast. It's on Spotify and Google Play. You can find it on all podcast streaming services. You can also get us in our weekly 2 Minutes with One Voice video series. So every week, one of the folks on today's webinar gives a quick 2-minute update on an issue of relevance to NTMA and PMA members. You can find that on both associations' YouTube channels. So lots of ways to hear from us between webinars. With all of those housekeeping notes you can see on today's agenda, there's much content to be covered. We have new guidance out from CDC, from OSHA, and updates on what is consuming all of Washington right now, which is infrastructure discussions and debates to see whether that next package from government can make it over the finish line. So with that, I think we're going to start with new guidance from CDC. And John, I will turn it over to you to tell the folks who are tuned in what they can expect from that guidance.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And just a reminder, those of you who have a question during the course of this webinar, feel free to type your question in the lower right-hand box, and we will try to answer them throughout the course of the webinar and not necessarily wait till the end, but feel free to utilize that, and we will try to address your questions during our presentation. The CDC came out with a couple of important guidances recently. Permitted activities for those people who are already vaccinated. They had indicated that you can resume your normal activities that you had prior to the pandemic. You no longer need to maintain the 6 feet distances. However, there is a requirement that everybody still must follow federal, state, local, business, and workplace guidances. For example, if you go to the airport, masks are still required. If you're on a train or a bus, those individual businesses could require you to maintain masks. If you travel within the United States, there's no need to get tested before you depart your situation. But if you're traveling internationally, while you do not need to get a test prior to departure, before returning back to this country, you do need to demonstrate that you had a negative test, or you have documentation indicating that you have recovered from a COVID incident. So those are just a couple important distinctions on domestic travel and international travel. The CDC also came out with cleaning and disinfecting guidelines, and this page generally has just a number of links that I encourage you to print this page off and give it to your appropriate person in your facility of how best to make sure your facilities are clean. For example, cleaning the facilities every day is still a requirement, or somebody's sick, then you need to clean it more frequently. So those are just a couple examples out there. But Omar, the CDC also came out with some new manufacturing guidelines and a new webpage.
Yeah, they did. And we're going to get into the OSHA emergency temporary standard in a little bit, because a lot of that is really based on the actions that the CDC took between May 28th and then going up until about June 17, as you've seen a number of these different requirements being put out. So while the OSHA ETS that we'll talk about in a minute focused largely on healthcare workers, what the CDC did is it broke out a number of different industry web pages and created ones in here specifically for manufacturing, did other ones for meat packing, others for restaurants. And the reason we wanted to put this out there is for a couple of reasons. One, to encourage you to go take a look at those manufacturing specific, but from a lobbying standpoint, we thought this was an important step in part of our lobbying activity, since we've been trying to make sure that they don't at CDC or OSHA have a one size fits all policy. And so by them doing an industry by industry guidance, as the CDC did, we find very encouraging in terms of we are going to hopefully have them lump us in with healthcare workforces and other areas. But just a quick reminder about having a qualified workplace coordinator that is identified. This is something that we spoke about way back even in April and May of last year when we were talking about contact tracing and having somebody that can speak directly with the local health provider community. But right here, again, they do want to make sure that the facility management has the ability to continue reaching out with regard to some of the prevention strategies and also on the hazardous controls, engineering controls, administrative controls. They had a couple of updates in there, but for the most part, they are reiterating that especially when you're looking at some of the folks that are vaccinated or are not, you are following the correct approach, as you'll see on the ETS in a minute. They really do separate out those that are vaccinated versus those that are not. But on this slide, we do want to also highlight the clarification, since we know, especially on the PMA HR listserv, this was coming up over the last few months quite a bit, about the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission requirements with regards to what is permitted and what is not. So they're not preventing you from requiring all employees that are entering the workplace to be vaccinated. So you can require that employee to be vaccinated, but you again have to keep in mind the reasonable accommodations and the religious exemption clauses that they've got in there. But we also do want to note that below, also they've said, this is very important since under the Obama era, this would have been interpreted much differently. But the Biden EEOC has said that the law does not prevent or limit the employer from having the ability to offer incentives to employees to voluntarily provide documentation, basically to confirm that they got a shot. So they are permitting the vaccinations. Now, there's some other areas we've talked about in the past that if you're providing something of value to an employee and then the other employee is ineligible for it because, again, of ADA issues, that you could run into some issues. I'd still suggest talking to an attorney or your HR department on that one. But I think it's an important development that they've given you all the green light to move forward there. But John, something that we've been waiting on for quite some time, and as John goes through this, what we really like you to visualize, especially those of you that are in California, is what set of my employees are fully vaccinated, that means 2 weeks plus, versus those that are not vaccinated, and how do I layer on these new government requirements that clearly differentiate between vaccinated and unvaccinated, John?
Yeah. This came about as a result of a executive order issued by President Biden, and this emergency temporary standard was expected to be released by March 15th. And when the proposal was originally submitted from OSHA to the OMB for final consideration, they had a number of meetings. Then CDC came out with additional guidances, and so that delayed the release of the emergency temporary standard till June. Our concern prior to the release of the emergency temporary standard that the OSHA would take a broad swipe at industry in general and lumping everybody together. But in the end, we were successful in limiting the emergency temporary standard to primarily, as Omar had mentioned, the healthcare workers. But as Omar said, there are other distinctions that are laying out there with this emergency temporary standard. And so these slides are very important to understand and make sure you and your management and your facilities understand the requirements out there. So.
Yeah, that's right. And when we look at this emergency temporary standard, it's important to make sure you're continuing to comply with your state and your local requirements, since those are still in place in many areas. Those of you, again, recall California, I think it was the 17th of June, so just about a week ago or so now, they came out with their latest iteration, I think their third major alteration. And there's some pretty solid visuals. Their FAQs are pretty strong, but again, they also look at the difference between who's vaccinated and who's an at-risk worker. And that's going to be that terminology that you continue to see and hear, especially on this slide as you take a look at. Now, this is taken directly from the latest ETS, and what they're saying, again, emergency temporary standard from OSHA, that the employers no longer need to take steps to protect their workers from COVID-19 exposure in any workplace or to find portions of a workplace where all employees are fully vaccinated. That is not our emphasis added. The OSHA underlined all employees are fully vaccinated. But again, employers should still take steps to protect the unvaccinated, implement physical distancing or unvaccinated, provide unvaccinated at-risk workers with face coverings or surgical masks. This is also really important in California and other areas. You do as an employer need to make sure that you have an adequate amount of surgical masks that are available for those that are at-risk employees that are currently not there. So what we would suggest is to make sure that you've got that all taken care of in terms of the backup, and take a look at your state. Question that just came in is an excellent question, which we alluded to a little bit in our video that we recorded this week, but we'll pause right now and read that. Will there be any future action that would give more consistency on guidance? We struggle communicating with employees on guidance and updates between federal guidance, governor guidance, EEOC, MyOSHA, Cal OSHA, Connecticut OSHA. Completely agree. What we're hearing is, as of right now, since CDC has put out their manufacturing specific guidance, that if OSHA were to issue anything further, it would simply be along the lines of that one from CDC. If you actually go onto that link from that CDC manufacturing page that we provided on a couple slides earlier, and you'll click on it, it actually says both CDC and OSHA at the very top of it. And I think that's the one that's dated around June 11. So we do believe that OSHA's done for now. The only qualifier to that is going to be Delta variant. And if they start to find out that an inordinate amount of vaccinated individuals are starting to feel sick, and that's pure speculation. And they were saying if that something happens like that, it's probably more into the fall. But as of right now, on consistency from the federal government, our understanding is OSHA believes that they are done at least for the summer, and we can't predict anything beyond the Labor Day because we don't know anything, as nobody really does. But I hope that helps. I know that the states are now going to look at what the federal government has put out in the last couple of weeks. Hopefully they will give you stability, but it is our understanding per that question that the federal government is done for now. Speaking of done for now, John, PPP loans, they are closed, but they were largely successful for most of our members.
Yeah, there's not a lot of positive when you talk to what good things government does. Well, this is a program that was truly successful. Close to 12 million loans were issued, totaling close to $800 billion to folks who were needing the Paycheck Protection Loan. 5,400 lenders involved. So the top chart is 20 and 21 loans, and then the bottom chart is a summary of just the project from 2021. So that's the good. The concern is this next slide is on the forgiveness. Is of the millions of loans that were issued out there, there still are remaining close to 1.7 million loans that have not requested forgiveness. And so if there's any of our NTMA or PMA members who have not submitted a loan forgiveness, please do so right away. We do recognize that the forgiveness process has slowed, specifically for those with larger loans with over $2 million. The SBA slowed down, so they're slowly ramping back up the approval process for some of those larger loans. They put it on hold for a little bit, but the PPP program has shut down, and we just encourage everybody to submit their loan forgiveness application. We frozen?
Sorry, yeah, and let's stay on this slide for one more second, since someone did just bring up a question on PPP loans. And on this is important with regards to forgiveness, since somebody just wrote in that their loan of over $2 million was just, their forgiveness was just approved this week, and congratulations to them. And that is consistent with what we are now hearing. Loans over $2 million, that forgiveness has been sitting out there for some of you going back to December. they are now starting to move on that. We are hearing of a number of them getting approved of forgiveness in the last week or since last Monday or so. The reason we were hearing is that the SBA slowed down their forgiveness reviews through a lot of April and then in the first couple of weeks of May in order so they could continue moving forward on processing new original loans on PPP1 and on second draw. And so that's what led to a lot of those delays. So if you are over 2 million and if you have not submitted your form 3509, you should absolutely get that going since now SBA is quickly moving. If you have not submitted forgiveness at all, you are certainly at risk, if not already in that window of starting to pay interest and starting to have to pay that back if your lender has not already sent you that notice. So if you were April of last year, you would have already received a notice saying you should start be paying your principal by now. So please make sure if you are in August of last year, approved loan, that you are already in the process of making sure your forgiveness is in, so you're not getting hung up on that one there. On the other side of it, and some of you might have seen this Wall Street Journal, as a horrible article for the SBA about a week ago or so. There's a number of divisions over at SBA, but those of you that have had challenges with the EIDL loans that are out there, those were run through the SBA Disaster Loan Office, which is separate from the PPP. And so that's why, even though PPP had its problems, the Disaster Loan Office has been managing a number of different loans, and that's been even more difficult over there. So continue to look for some additional audit and congressional oversight. John, speaking of Congress, and we'll get to Paul eventually so he can make his infrastructure week joke, but they're getting there. We'll see what they end up with, but there definitely has been progress this week during infrastructure week.
Yes, a group of 21, it started as a G20, a group of 21, 11 Republican senators and 10 Democrat senators came to an agreement on a hard infrastructure bill. That's roads, bridges, broadband, ports, et cetera. President Biden proposed a hard infrastructure bill and then a family infrastructure bill. And so this bipartisan agreement is on the hard infrastructure. So the bills are going on a two-track approach. There's an agreement on these hard roads. We're still a long ways away. They got to put this in legislative language, and they have to have it scored to make sure it has raises enough money, et cetera. But that is one angle. But progressives are insisting, and Speaker Pelosi has insisted, and yesterday at the president's press conference, he insisted that he's not going to sign just his bipartisan hard infrastructure bill. He wants a family infrastructure bill as well. That is going to be a partisan approach where the Democrats in the House and the Senate are going to pass a budget resolution that calls for a budget reconciliation, which you only need 50 votes. So every Democrat senator will need to vote for that piece of legislation with the vice president breaking the tie. It's uncertain. I believe the president's proposal was an additional, so his original hard infrastructure was 2-point-something trillion, an additional 2 trillion in family infrastructure. Last week, Bernie Sanders, who's chairman of the budget committee, sent out his dream bill of roughly $6 trillion, which combined both of them. That's not going to happen, but we do see the Congress having to come to grips with how are they going to deal with the family infrastructure, and that's going to be some green technology, information technologies that they want included, enhanced family medical leave and paid sick leave, community colleges, free community colleges, daycare, and such. So that is some of the major components that's going to be in that family infrastructure bill. Eventually, we are conceptually these bills will come together shortly. I mean, Pelosi's indicated she wants the Senate to pass the family infrastructure bill before they take up the hard infrastructure bill. But we're still, we're a long ways to go. As Omar wrote on one of the slides, I think it's going to be easier to get 11 or 12 Republican senators to support this family bill, to support this bill, than get those last 2 Democrat senators, because Senator Manchin from West Virginia and Sinema from Arizona, and quite candidly, I think there are a handful of others that are going to be critical in negotiating this family infrastructure bill and determining how it's paid for.
Yeah, and just a couple of things on the process here is you will not see a vote by the Democrats on that bipartisan infrastructure bill until we have a reconciliation measure that they all agree upon. So it would be silly and crazy for the progressives and the liberals to go ahead and agree to anything unless they've got not just a guarantee, but they actually take the vote first. And so Speaker Pelosi is going to insist on the bill moving through over on the Senate side first and then coming over to the House, so that way that they can see what happens here. To John's point, we still haven't been scored. It is over 5 years, $973 billion. Even the new spending amounts, they've moved money around. What they're doing is they're anticipating additional revenue based on certain growth aspects. And so, for example, in one of the areas, they thought they'd be able to collect some more money by creating more program integrity to the tune of $40 billion, whereas Biden only thinks it would create $14 billion. So we're still dealing with monopoly money. I'm still very, very cautious and hesitant on this, because I think even if you are going to get a number of these Republicans, say 5, or even if you get 11 of them, then you're going to obviously start losing the Democrats, to John's point, and McConnell's not going to get on board. None of the House Republicans are going to get on board. And I think that everyone in this town is watching the Senate too closely, because that's just where all the characters are. But really, I think it's over on the House side that ultimately that Pelosi knows she's not going to have all those votes with her unless that Biden can guarantee that they have that larger family infrastructure bill, as they call it. And right now they don't have climate provisions. They don't have anything in here for the progressives to support that bipartisan agreement. As you can see on what the framework of spending looks like right now, as we mentioned, this is new money on transportation, 579 traditional roads and bridges. And then you see the broadband number in some of the other areas on wastewater. And so the timeline of this, again, as we'll jump to here as you all digest it, but even if this bipartisan bill, let's say these negotiations fall apart, which I think still a very strong likelihood they do, these dollar amounts are probably still going to form the foundation of a final infrastructure bill for a hard surface. And then we'll get into, down the line, the more family-oriented issues that John mentioned that are out there. But John, I still think they're further away from a deal. Let's work our way backwards. The president has said that he wants something done by September 30th, which is the start of the new fiscal year. In order to do so, the House Budget Committee is going to have to move a reconciliation budget resolution through the committee that week of July 12th. The following week, the full House floor will have to vote on that budget resolution to get that done, and the Senate would subsequently have to take that up into early August, and they have them ready for the actual resolution measure itself for a floor vote in both Senate and House on the final bill in September. That seems tight, John. I think they can get the budget reconciliation resolutions done in July, but getting the actual bill done, I think, is a little tough.
Yeah, with Democrats only having such a slim 4 or 5 seat majority in the House, and no room for error in the Senate, there's a big divide. I mean, there's some different priorities for what the progressives and what many Democrats in Congress want versus what the president wants. I would argue that we've seen comments by the chairman of the tax rating committee, Richie Neal, that he says, well, maybe the whole bill doesn't need to be paid for. Well, President Biden says the bill needs to be paid for. So there are there are divisions. We've heard from a number of progressive senators and House members who said, if there's not the green technology, I'm not voting for it. Well, how far will these moderate Democrats in the Midwest and the West, how are they going to vote on a lot of this green technology, which has a very different impact on their districts than, for example, some of the progressives coming from New York and then in the Northeast. So I am skeptical. So I agree with Omar that they can get the budget resolution done, but getting a budget reconciliation bill with the nuts and bolts passed with such a slim majority in September is going to be a heavy lift, which is why Omar and I have been touting ever since the president proposed this infrastructure bill that likely doesn't happen until sometime October through December.
All right. So how are they going to pay for this thing? As you can see, there's a number of areas in here that they're going to generate a certain amount of funding. Some of this is real money, some of it's monopoly money. But the most important thing for this bipartisan proposal agreement is there are no direct tax increases on individuals. Now, those of you that import, yes, there's going to be additional user fees and some other areas that are going to be out there with regards to environmental assessment fees. But for the most part, there are not any direct taxes that are going to be increased or imposed. But that's what's really going to be tied up into the next bill. That's called the family bill. That's going to be a lot larger. And that's where a lot of these tax issues are still on the table. And John and I are having direct meetings with folks up on the Hill about what their plans are and some of the negotiations that are ongoing with regards to the different tax areas. I'll just highlight the one areas that I'm most focused on and most concerned about are going to be the 199A. You're going to see a bill coming out by Chairman Wyden of the Senate Finance Committee here shortly, possibly even this week, with regards to what he wants to do with the 20% deduction for pass-through businesses that we fought so hard, and he might try to narrow that as well, although we're hearing that he's not at this point looking at changing the end date on it, but at least changing who qualifies. So at least that's somewhat half a loaf. And then also the retroactivity potentially on capital gains and estate tax, LIFO, last in, first out, and like-kind exchanges would be, and net operating loss. Those are the 5 areas that we're most concerned about on retroactivity. But John, I think they're still going to have to figure out how to pay for a good amount of this, and the corporate tax rate seems to certainly be part of it, but I don't think it's a done deal yet.
Yeah, the president proposed increasing the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. Well, that was just basically a non-starter, and it looks like the Congress is going to, at least some of the moderates have indicated, a willingness to support a 25% corporate rate. And so that's why Omar and I often say, don't look at what the tax rate is, look at how much money is raised. And so by lowering the corporate rate from 28 to 25%, it loses revenue from the proposal. So policymakers need to find different ways to get that money, which is why one of the justifications, I believe Senator Wyden, as Omar said, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, is going to come up with his package, which will include, perhaps limiting the availability of Section 199A that we've been fighting about. 2 weeks ago, the G7 finance ministers agreed to a 15% minimum global tax. And this is in addition to the corporate tax, this minimum global tax is also a significant part of the pay for this infrastructure program. And so now it's up to Congress to pass it. When you hear people say, everybody needs to pay their fair share, this is who they're talking about, is those super large corporations who pay a reduced amount, little or a reduced amount of taxes. And so that is the goal of what this is. But the other really where a lot of revenue is coming from is elimination of stepped up basis and capital gains, as Omar touched on. Fortunately, a lot of the moderate Democrats and the farm state Democrats are really pushing back, in that particular provision. And as Omar said, there's also, in addition to the policy issues, there's the retroactivity issues of at what point is it retroactive without messing up the markets? Is it January? Is it April? Or is it June? We'll see. So.
Yep, absolutely. A couple other areas just to keep on going. And obviously it's time to start talking with your tax planners to the extent that you can. One question that did just come in was about the Section 179, and that's the equipment expensing that many of you recall we all worked on for a number of time, a long time, that talks about the one-time deduction. On Section 179, talking about changes to it, the question came in, do you see any changes in unlimited Section 179? For those companies that meet that definition of eligible under the 179 under TCJA, that's not something we're hearing right now a whole lot on. To be honest, we were part of a 179 coalition back then in 2017 lobbying on it, and we're back on the 199, the R&D, so the 174. We're on a 127 about education expenses. But our folks over on 179, we honestly have not been that active because we just haven't heard that being on the chopping block. That is really one of the more popular ones because it directly seems to benefit small businesses. On the bonus depreciation side, and then 163J on the EBITDA, on the DA, and the depreciation and amortization, those are definitely at risk out there for certain types of businesses. But those that would meet the definition of small businesses, at least on the 179, and to the extent on some of the bonus, we're hearing that those are still intact. But just because we haven't heard any rumors yet on them being changed, but those are certainly on our radar screen for us to watch out for there as well. One other thing, let's just jump right into supply chains as we're getting on the half hour right now, since we know there's a lot of disruption going on. We don't want to get too much into this, but do note that really was a wake-up call to Washington, D.C. in the last year and a half about supply chains. the previous administration really did begin, even in 2017, looking at how they can try to address some of the rare earth minerals that are out there in the shortages. But now Congress is jumping in, and they're moving through on what we're calling a supply chain China bill. In the Senate, as you can see, they move, and this is something on which we're actively lobbying. The Senate moved a bill, 2,000-page bill a couple of weeks ago that does address everything from STEM to PPE contracts to state-owned enterprises over in China, and establishing a manufacturing strategy, industrial innovation policy, and innovation hubs around the country. So these are some things that we are supportive of working on. And just note that Congress is working on these supply chain issues, but they're not going to be immediate solution. We did just want to flag that for you, especially since the administration on June 8th did just complete its 250-page report on supply chains that are out there, semiconductors, everything from magnesium and sole source concerns there to some of the recommendations that you can find. But I just want to turn it over to Paul for a second as we get into our main concern on supply chains and on raw materials, as you'll see on this slide, as we start talking a bit more on steel, tool steel that our members use, and some of the other standards tool that others use.
Yeah, you know, we keep track pretty closely using steel benchmarker of steel prices, and they continue, as I don't have to tell this crowd, to go up or stay steady. But more importantly, the gap is even becoming larger with the rest of the world, particularly the EU and China. We're starting to see the media focus less, you know, not only on tariffs, but as Omar has just been discussing, supply chain disruptions. We had an AP reporter reach out to us this week. We've had several reporters in the last couple of weeks talk about this. So, you know, it's clearly getting attention. I know we've had some relief on lumber prices and copper. PMA had a webinar with a steel analyst a couple of weeks ago, and, you know, he wasn't expecting any relief for the rest of the year as far as the steel prices, Omar.
You know, on that front, yeah, we'd agree on that. We had a question come in with regards to the infrastructure. Do you have a sense of how much steel product this bill will drive demand for? And some of the NTMA people would have seen this at their conference last week, but we took this slide out. But if the US was going to rely on green technologies to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, give you an idea of the amount of steel they'd have to do. Of solar panels, the equivalent of 6,700 of the Golden Gate Bridge. In order to get there for wind turbines, it would take the equivalent of steel in 22,000 Golden Gate bridges. I'm a California kid. So that gives you a visualization and a real concern as you start to think about your supply chain management and your strategies, your purchasing strategies moving into not just the rest of this calendar year, but into next summer and beyond. If they do move forward with an infrastructure bill, the question premise is absolutely correct. You should be thinking long term about additional demand increases and shortages that are going to last. And that's a real concern. I mean, John, we did see some progress when the president was over at the EU, but the tariffs are still in place, it looks like, possibly until the end of the year. I think you might be on mute, John, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think John is so surprised that the tariffs are going to remain that he's speechless, but.
Agreed. Go ahead, Paul, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, as we talk, I think some of you have been watching these US-EU negotiations, there was on the positive side, the EU and the US have agreed to suspend the tariffs on the Boeing Airbus Section 301 dispute, and through the good work of Omar and John, as you know, we've been able to keep copper alloys off the US list, but, you know, with the that threat going away, that threat against additional tariffs on copper alloys is going to go away with it. Unfortunately, not as much progress on steel tariffs. In fact, a leaked draft of the declaration had a December 1st deadline that the EU and the US agreed to as far as negotiating an end to the tariffs. As you may recall, there is a retaliatory tariff against US exports. Most prominent is whiskey. that was scheduled to go up to 50% in retaliation for the US steel tariffs, but the EU had previously delayed that pending negotiations. A draft declaration, in the draft declaration, it said that they were going to try to reach an agreement by December 1st. The final declaration has that slipping a little and just says by the end of the year. There was not a lot of mention about the steel tariffs talk post EU meeting. The EU still says, we are, intent on negotiating a solution. I know that today I was reading about there's a lot of pressure inside Europe by those who consume whiskey not to increase those tariffs and also to get rid of them. So there's a lot of pressure building each way, and that's why it's so important that we continue to be out there talking about this. But I think, as Omar and John have been saying, that an immediate lifting of all the Section 232 steel tariffs against everybody is not going to happen, but we are optimistic that we can start getting them lifted on our allies, first EU and UK, and then Japan and others.
And I think that's the important point here to take a look at, is in the order in which this may or may not happen. There's literally no chance that they will be lifted on China in this calendar year, obviously, and largely I would even lump in possibly some other countries as well, whether it's Brazil, India, or others. But I think that you are going to start with the European Unions plus, say, South Korea and Japan. But look at the next key date for us is going to be the end of October, when the G20 is going to get together to meet in Rome. And so by then we expect to have a deal in hand, but you can be assured that the steel industry is not going to walk away empty-handed. And so we've already started to get notices from some of you, others, please let us know, but surcharges already starting to kick in from the steel industry. So they're starting to see the reality that their tariff coaster is going to end here soon. But are we going to get quotas? Are we going to get some other limitations? When you start to read in the paper or hear from us that the Europeans are making progress with the US on how to address Chinese overcapacity and oversupply, that's when you know we're going to get closer on some kind of an agreement. So you cannot have an agreement with the US and EU on steel and aluminum until you have an agreement against China on those products as well. So that's in the large ways of what we're working our way backwards. But back to Paul and Caitlin, to your point, it is keeping that emphasis up, staying active in the media has been really helpful as well.
All right, I'll take it, Caitlin.
I was waiting for you. I didn't want to step on one. I thought you were going to say something.
As you can see, we continue to try to emphasize the impact that the tariffs have had on all of you, and we've succeeded in having a great number of media stories. PMA and NTMA are leading the charge on as far as publicizing the problems that the tariffs have caused U.S. manufacturers. In fact, Omar and John and Caitlin and I represent both associations with the National Foreign Trade Council's 232 Steel Coalition, which is about 100 organizations and companies that get together and who are impacted either directly or indirectly through retaliatory tariffs. We led the effort. It was Omar's idea to get a U.S. Trade Association letter to President Biden after 7 domestic steel industry related associations sent a letter. We had more than 30 U.S. trade associations send a letter. Everybody from apparel manufacturers, the Beer Institute, and others who signed on to that letter. So that came on the heels of more than, as we've talked about, more than 300 manufacturers also signing a letter to President Biden that went out 2 weeks before. Many folks from NTMA and PMA signed that letter, and we also led the charge. So this is, as veterans of the wars on Section 201 tariffs back in 2002, domestic pressure combined with threats of retaliation really is the formula to get rid of these tariffs. So thank you for those who are participating in this media effort and for signing those letters.
Yeah, thank you. But John, one other thing we talk about on supply chain disruptions, it still goes back to the workforce issues. And now we're starting to see, okay, well, lifting the $300 subsidy and terminating that in these 26 states, will that really make a difference? Will it not? What are some of the factors? But certainly there's a lot of job opens out there right now, John. Nope, don't have John back. All right, then we'll stick with it. So quickly here, these are our latest. If you all type into your Google machine, JOLTS, JOLTS, and BLS, that will pull back for you the information on what's out there for the durable goods and how many jobs are currently open. Right now, what we're seeing are there 20, this was 25, we now have 26 states. The first Democratic governor in Louisiana just now came out and said he's going to terminate the $300 surplus from the federal government on unemployment insurance. So that will be a change that comes out as well. What we are seeing here is definitely some progress in the U.S. House of Representatives, especially with regards to workforce and some of the hearings that they're having on Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And the Senate behind the scenes is still putting together their bill with regards to the National Apprenticeship Act. So we are starting to see, and hopefully in July, we're going to see a bill come out. There's still question whether or not that will be attached and included inside the actual final infrastructure bill, the family's infrastructure bill, or they'll move on their own. But Congress has definitely recognized the challenges of recruiting workers, and they are trying to help promote awareness in that space over the summertime. So we think that is an important development coming from the Hill. We'll probably see additional job spending. Thank you for those that did sign on to the action alert. If you have not yet, please go on to metalworkingadvocate.org. At the top, there's take action, and that's a space where we definitely also need the help to make sure that you've got the adequate training and funding programs to the associations and others that to make sure you've got that pipeline that's built out there. And that's something that Caitlin has also been, and Paul and her team have been doing a great job over on the media of pushing that message out, Caitlin, as well, with regards to making sure there's awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. So we, in addition to the media requests that we've already talked about on issues like trade and tariffs, we do get a lot of media inquiries on the skills gap and labor shortages, particularly as the nation comes out of the pandemic and industries across the board grapple with a labor shortage. So thank you to members who are willing to speak to press about your own efforts to recruit and retain a skilled workforce. We can always get media coverage on that topic when folks make themselves available for interviews. So thank you to people who have done those interviews, and please do continue to send us your press releases and other announcements, or if you need our assistance in drafting those kinds of documents as you put together more programs aimed at workforce development.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a top priority. And just quickly on that, one more thought on the $300, just some insight, since we've got a Pennsylvania reference, a Pittsburgh chapter reference from NTMA, since we did have a virtual meeting with one of their local members of Congress, a Democrat, Connor Lamb, around the Pittsburgh area. And one of the things that he brought up, and other Democrats have as well with regards to the $300, when they passed that extension going into September 6th, they didn't fully have an idea of how successful the vaccination campaign would be, how many people would be vaccinated in different communities, and that was their thinking behind it. I think quietly, and if you talk to some Democrats on the Hill, they'd say, yeah, probably we should have gone through June 30th rather than into Labor Day, because there actually were some discussions about first it was June, then it was August, and we ended up at September 6th, which actually was a Republican number that was thrown out there. So there is an understanding of that being a factor among many of the other factors that were mentioned. But to Caitlin's point, thank you for those that have been involved in that area. Thank you for those that have been supporting the advocacy efforts over the last year. And here are the links to please continue to do so we can continue to bring content. Without your membership in the associations, you obviously would not be seeing this content, and being able to use us and others as a resource. And to let you know that members of Congress separately are asking us for money from our political action campaigns. So those PAC dollars we're going to need to talk to some of you about. Please contact Bill Padnos or Christy Carmigiano for more information of how we can support to make sure we've got people up on Capitol Hill that actually know what they're doing and represent manufacturing, since you can see how much spending and what is going on. And with that, as John mentioned earlier, please feel free to type in any questions you have on the right-hand side into the question box, and we'll hang on the line for a couple of extra minutes. This is how you can reach out to us at any time. And you'll see that there's links again to how you can continue to support your association supporting you. As Caitlin mentioned, this webinar will also be emailed out to those that have registered along with a copy, so you can share with those in your shops. We've got just a couple of quick questions and we'll go ahead and try to wrap up here so we're about 45 right on time. One other questions that we had: can manufacturers directly ask its employees if they are vaccinated or not, so you know who is at risk and who is not? The EEOC, and the answer is yes, you may ask if they are vaccinated. However, you may not ask why they are not vaccinated. So you cannot go into those ADA covered reasons of why they are not vaccinated. To stay away from those issues that could be because if they have an illness, a medical underlying condition, or that they've got a religious reason. So you cannot go down that pathway, but you can ask a yes or no question. As always, make sure you're in touch with your HR folks and your labor people to make sure you've got your wording correctly on that one. Are there any other questions that are out there? I think we might have answered most of them. No, seeing none. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll have another webinar in about a month or so. In July, feel free to reach out again to your NTMA or PMA contacts or to us directly, and we're happy to help as always. Thanks everyone. Enjoy your weekend.